Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Uli, and this is episode 3 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, we're going to talk about the war on drugs. And first of all, when I was thinking about this episode, the episode I'm putting together for you today is not the episode that I envisioned. But as I was working, preparing for this episode, I came across an article that I thought was too good not to share. And so I'm going to share that article with you today. I'm going to release a number of episodes on the war on drugs. So this will be sort of an introduction to the topic, and we'll go into more detail in future episodes about some of the details, some of the problems with the war on drugs, some of the numbers behind the problem with the war on drugs, and then also some of the solutions that I think we can look to or look toward to help solve the problems that the war on drugs was intended to solve, or at least the stated intentions. So with that being said, the article I'm going to be sharing with you today is called "The Drug War's Assault on Liberty." And it's an article by Lance Lamberton that is available on fee.org, which is the Foundation for Economic Education. And Lance Lamberton, he's a communications professional he was the deputy director of the White House Office of Policy Information during the Reagan administration, which is interesting because President Reagan was not the one who started the war on drugs, but he ramped up the war on drugs significantly. So it's interesting that he was part of that administration. So anyway, again, it's the Drug War's Assault on Liberty by Lance Lamberton. And this is actually a relatively old article. It's from the year 2000. But a lot of the problems that he identifies in this article exist today to an even greater degree, at least in my opinion. And as a criminal defense attorney, I'd like to share some of my personal experiences with the war on drugs and the harm that I believe that it causes. And like I said, I'm not going to get into that today. I'd like to get into some of that in future episodes. But this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I see the problems that persist from this war on drugs day after day. And I don't think it's something that the general public is aware of, at least the extent of it. And so I think this is a huge problem for our liberty, this war on drugs, for the people who are victims directly of the war on drugs, and also those of us who don't use drugs, don't have any interest in drugs, but are nevertheless affected by the costs of it. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get into the article here. So here we go. In determining the proper boundaries of government action consistent with a free society, it is instructive to explore whether drug prohibition is an appropriate response to actions that are clearly self-destructive to some. Following from concern over the harmful effects of drugs, the prevailing view is that government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from that harm through prohibition. Yet that position runs directly counter to the foundation and maintenance of a free society. Indeed, in today's context, drug prohibition represents one of the single greatest threats to our liberties. Foremost to understanding the threat prohibition imposes to liberty is a proper understanding of rights. According to the Declaration of Independence, we are endowed with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The underlying assumption is that one's life is one's own. Thus, the choices a person makes with his own life properly belong to him. This principle is not hard to embrace. The idea that the individual owns his own life is accepted almost implicitly, especially in countries with a tradition of free thought and institutions, such as the United States. Yet it is a principle readily abandoned when it comes to drugs. Underlying the idea that government, and not the individual, has the right to determine what one may or may not ingest is the assumption that government, and not the individual, has ultimate authority over and ownership of life itself. Taken to its logical conclusion, this principle leads to slavery. This does not mean government has no right to restrict and prohibit harmful behavior, but it must do so only to enhance and protect freedom of action. The old axiom that my freedom to swing my arms ends where your nose begins applies here. The essential point is that the individual has the right to do whatever he wants with his own life, since he has a property in that life, provided that he does not interfere with the same freedom of another. With drug prohibition, the government attempts to coerce citizens into abstaining from something it deems harmful. This, in essence, is criminal behavior elevated to the status of law because it involves the initiation of force or threat of force against a class of citizens, in this case, illicit drug users, who are engaged in voluntary, non-coercive behavior. Moreover, the policy is doomed to failure, as witnessed by the daily news reports on the government's drug war, which clearly show that the government will never be able to stop individuals from taking drugs, short of imposing an Orwellian 1984 level of surveillance on its citizens. And judging from the ready availability of drugs in prison, even that is unlikely to work. The bottom line is that criminal action implies a victim, where force or the threat of force is imposed on another. However, what the individual freely does to himself, such as taking drugs, does not constitute the imposition of force and is therefore not a crime. On the contrary, it is the prosecution of the drug war that is the crime. The devastating impact of the drug war on society, along with its inevitable failure, is a consequence of its protagonists' failure to recognize a salient fact of human nature. Namely, there will always be some individuals strongly driven to take drugs because they provide pleasure or block pain, and no legal sanctions, no matter how severe, will prevent that. Furthermore, the more draconian the drug enforcement, the more draconian the consequences by every measure imaginable, from diminished civil liberty to increased violent crime. Criminal activity normally involves no more than a small fraction of any given population. Yet when laws are dramatically at variance with the legitimate exercise of freedom, wide-scale disobedience is often the result. Such was the case with alcohol prohibition, conscription during the war between the states and the Vietnam War, civil disobedience during America's civil rights movement, and general disregard for the national 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. Prohibition also fails to acknowledge the power of markets. By making a desired substance illegal, prohibition increases profitability by making the substance scarcer and more risky to handle. In the pursuit of self-interest and in light of the enormous profits earned from the illicit drug trade, there will always be a plentiful supply of risk takers willing to run the gamut of government interdiction efforts to meet the demand for drugs. Ironically, the scarcer drugs become more profitable because of prohibition, and therefore drug dealers have a greater incentive to sell them. Thus, it is profit and the pleasure derived from taking drugs that thwarts the increasingly militant calls for an all-out drug war. Not surprisingly, when government attempts to deny basic individual sovereignty, it must intrude with reckless abandon on other rights to enforce its objectives. Protection from unreasonable search and seizure, as guaranteed by the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, is a prime target for drug warriors. Calls for universal drug testing are beginning to surface, regardless of any concern for probable cause. Former New York Mayor Ed Koch and others have even called for shooting down planes merely suspected of carrying drugs. Tragically, the war on drugs, allegedly being prosecuted to protect human life, has instead claimed many innocent lives. Take, for example, those caught in the crossfire between warring gangs of drug dealers fighting over turf, or trigger-happy drug enforcement agents who raid the wrong homes and accidentally kill residents defending their families against violent assault. Additional fatalities in the drug war include deaths attributed to drug overdoses or poisoned drugs owing to the adulteration and unknown potency of drugs traded on the illicit market. The war on drugs has also become a significant factor in the spread of AIDS. Almost 7,000 intravenous drug users a year have died of AIDS from sharing needles. Despite this tragic loss of life, prohibitionists claim that legalization will result in a dramatic increase in use, thereby dwarfing the number of fatalities directly attributable to prohibition. However, considering that 80% of deaths from ingestion of heroin and cocaine is caused by their adulteration on the black market, leaving 20% who die as a result of factors that would exist after legalization, it would require a 400% increase in use to equal the current death toll. This is unlikely. At the end of alcohol prohibition, estimates of increased consumption have ranged from 0 to 250%. On the contrary, it could be argued that consumption of hard drugs such as heroin and cocaine would actually decline with legalization, especially among vulnerable youth in the inner cities. This is because tens of thousands of hardcore users would no longer be pushing drugs to non-users in order to make money to support their own habits, a common and well-known practice throughout the drug culture. When we look at how alcohol is marketed and distributed, we can see how legalization will put the neighborhood pusher out of business. In addition to the death toll coming from prohibition, the costs related to drug enforcement are staggering. Since President Reagan launched his much heralded war in the early 1980s, the United States has spent nearly $300 billion to stem the flow, with indirect costs put at $67 billion annually as government continues to beef up the budgets of law enforcement agencies and the military to prosecute the drug war. The courts are so overwhelmed with drug cases that the administration of justice is being hampered to an intolerable degree. For example, in 1998, more than 400,000 Americans serving prison terms, 1 in 4 imprisoned, were doing so for drug offenses, up from 50,000, or 1 in 10, in 1980. Prohibition also has the unfortunate consequence of corrupting law enforcement agents lured by the easy availability of huge sums of tax-free income in return for their cooperation in the drug trade. According to reporters Jack Nelson and Ronald Ostro, law enforcement corruption, sparked mostly by illegal drugs, has become so rampant that the number of federal, state, and local officials in federal prisons has multiplied 5 times in 4 years, from 107 in 1994 to 548 in 1998. On the civil liberties front, the drug war has led to the property of non-drug users being confiscated without due process. In operations labeled zero tolerance, leased boats are searched, sometimes without satisfying the legal standard of probable cause, and then seized from their owners when even minute quantities of drugs are found on board. Indeed, fully 80% of total asset seizures related to the drug war occur without a criminal charge being filed. Another casualty in the war on drugs is legitimate scientific research with drugs, such as LSD and MDMA. In addition, marijuana has been almost universally prohibited for use as a treatment for glaucoma, which leads to blindness, and for ameliorating the severe side effects of chemotherapy. Inherent in the prohibitionist position is the failure to recognize individual responsibility and autonomy as operating principles for an efficacious life. While taking drugs involves the freedom to engage in what may be self-destructive behavior, it also, and more importantly, involves the principle of allowing for life-enhancing activity. The freedom to fail is also the freedom to succeed, and vice versa. Ultimately, only the individual can determine what is in his best interest. While that is not a fail-safe mechanism, the alternative is tyranny. Drug prohibitionists embrace that alternative by presuming to know what is best for others, and in the pursuit of their vision of the good life, they are willing to impose that vision on others by force. To counter the argument for individual responsibility, prohibitionists claim that drugs necessarily hurt others and society at large. Discounting the preponderance of evidence that prohibition imposes a much greater cost on society than legalization ever could, the fact remains that even for those who use drugs in a life-threatening way, it is their lives that they threaten. Society and even loved ones do not have a property right in the life of the drug abuser. To assume otherwise is collectivism, pure and simple. If prohibitionists were interested in consistency, their line of reasoning would take them down a path I doubt many of them would want to follow. Would they propose banning tobacco or alcohol consumption because of potentially harmful effects? How about high cholesterol foods? With heart disease being the single greatest killer of Americans today, are prohibitionists prepared to follow their own logic and ban bacon and eggs? And what about high-risk occupations and activities such as stunt car driving, hang gliding, and motorcycling? Assuming you could successfully ban such activities and substances, what would be the implications for the role that risk-taking plays in enhancing the enjoyment of life? While most people avoid risk in the realm of health or physical activity, others are drawn to it because it enriches their lives. The very essence of individuality implies that different people have different requirements in achieving happiness. Drug prohibitionists, however, will claim that illicit drugs can never have any other effect than to debilitate and destroy. Yet even among the most dangerous drugs, addiction is far from guaranteed. Dosage has everything to do with a drug's potentially harmful effects, and if doses are low enough and taken infrequently enough, no long-term or short-term ill effects will result. Besides, the critical point, which cannot be emphasized enough, is that ownership of one's life entitles one to do with it what one chooses, even if that choice leads to self-destruction. In light of the futility in waging the war on drugs, what leads the government to pursue it and most Americans to support it? Part of the answer lies in the coercive nature of government itself. If war, as Randolph Bourne stated, is the health of the state, then the American government is on a very healthy diet. Since government is predicated on the use of force, it oftentimes sees its reason for being and exercising it. If this power is used to protect rights, it is a benevolent force, but the temptation to abuse that power is sometimes irresistible. While the line between using government force in retaliation against initiators and being the initiator itself is a clear one, it is a line easily crossed. There is also a need on the part of government to fight an enemy, take on a menace, and be the paternalistic guardian of the people. Indeed, if office holders do not have the commodity of fear and the specter of menace to incite people to rally around them for support, they risk, in a democracy, repudiation at the polls from bored and fickle voters, and in a dictatorship, the violent overthrow of the government. Hollywood and the media have certainly done their parts in feeding the current frenzy. Grisly news reports on the drug war and its victims boost ratings and provide ample grist for sensationalized TV specials and movies. This in turn creates the popular illusion that it is the drugs themselves that cause the violence and crimes associated with them, rather than their prohibition. Yet we have only to look back to the era of alcohol prohibition to identify the real source of drug-related violence. In the 10 years following the end of alcohol prohibition, the murder rate from assault by firearms went down from the prohibition high of 16 per 100,000 of population in 1933 to less than 9 per 100,000 by 1943. America's drug war is also a manifestation of the historical pendulum swinging towards social conservatism. Operating in cycles that run on the order of 20 years, America is reacting to the social excesses of the 1960s. Sexual mores have become more restrictive, drinking is less socially acceptable, and smokers' rights have become severely circumscribed. Indeed, the current trend, popular among both conservatives and liberals, is to place under cultural and political assault activities that give pleasure and hold the potential for harm. The safety at any cost approach toward regulating consumer choices, championed by environmental and consumer activists such as Ralph Nader, is but one variant of the kind of government paternalism now in vogue. America's puritanical heritage, while dramatically at variance with its heritage of political liberty, has endured as well as it has owing to the lure of messianic perfectionism. Few countries in the West are as blessed as the United States with the number and intensity of moral crusaders determined to use government to impose their moral values on others by force. This puritanical impulse is enjoying a major resurgence in the United States. Historically, America has been a magnet for cultural extremes, ranging from the free love communes of the 60s to the abstinent Shaker communities of the early 19th century. In the history of the Western world, no other country embarked on the bizarre path of alcohol prohibition, despite alcohol's deep historical, cultural, and economic roots. The U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights have held America's crusading impulse in check. Nevertheless, it persists, ebbing and flowing as circumstance and public opinion dictate. Another factor fueling the drug war is an undeniable increase in drug use, a trend that started in the 60s. Yet, can the increase in any way correlate with the hysteria that has overtaken America in the decades that followed? Indeed, deaths attributed to drug use are but a small percentage of deaths related to alcohol and tobacco. And despite despite hyperbolic claims by politicians and the media over the threat that drugs pose to our society and culture, the economy continues to grow. Life expectancies continue to increase. Technological advances continue unabated. And Americans in all walks of life continue to build lives of meaning and value, both for themselves and their families. The most tragic consequences related to drug use persist in America's inner cities. Yet here it is government paternalism that is the culprit, leading people without hope into lives of drug dependency. As the debilitating effects of welfare dependency strangle motivation and opportunity, the seductive lure of drug profits or the temporary relief that drugs bring provides a market for drugs that otherwise would not exist. Predicting the future is always a risky business. But when it comes to determining what path Americans will choose concerning drug policy, both history and a proper understanding of human nature give us some guideposts. People eventually tire of moral crusades. No matter how lofty or seemingly righteous, there comes a time when people's energy and direction must go elsewhere. For example, the wave of progressive reform that began at the end of the 19th century eventually burned itself out, to be replaced by the relative social liberalism of the Roaring Twenties. The strident anti-communism of the McCarthy era in the 50s gave way to the new left that engulfed America's universities in the 60s. But the real undoing of the drug war will be the eventual realization that government cannot alter human nature, and that society is no longer willing to pay the price required in money, social disruption, and reduced liberty to prosecute this war. In the past decade, especially, many prominent voices have been raised against prohibition, and no doubt many others will join them in the near future. Moreover, prohibitionists are finding themselves compelled to respond in public to the growing call for legalization to an extent that would have been unheard of 10 years ago. Yet until the current level of support for prohibition burns itself out, vigilance and the courage to speak out are required if we are to avoid the permanent establishment of new forms of government intrusion into our personal lives. That is the real threat facing us today. All right, that's the end of the article. I hope you enjoyed that article and found it interesting and informative. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, this was an article by Lance Lamberton on fee.org, and I'll link to the article in the episode's show notes. I think this article serves to provide some good foundational thoughts on the war on drugs. You might wonder, the show is called The Forge of Freedom. Why talk about the war on drugs so early? Well, it's a huge problem, and not only for the people caught up in the war itself, but for the people who bear the financial costs and the cost of losing our civil liberties. And this won't change until more people are aware of the widespread problem. As a criminal defense attorney, I see the problem every day, but many people in the general public aren't aware of what's going on and at what expense. So I plan to do more episodes on the war on drugs. I hope this was a useful starting point and at least starts some thought and some consideration of the topic. So the more informed you are about freedom and the notions of freedom, the more able you will be to fight for freedom. So arm yourself with the message of freedom and spread the word. Because I think a lot of people in the general public don't know what's going on with the war on drugs, are not aware of the harm that it's causing. And I want to end this episode just kind of outlining some additional problems with the war on drugs that were touched on in the article, but I just want to point out to emphasize here at the end. I think that by making drugs illegal, this country has put millions of people in prison at a cost of billions of dollars per year, not only for no benefit, but at great cost and great harm. The United States, the so-called land of the free, incarcerates more people than any country in the world. And it's at a staggering rate if you look at the charts on this. We've also spent billions annually for the expansion of law enforcement. Again, huge financial cost. And oftentimes, those funds are used at the expense of our privacy and our liberties. We've created violence and death. Once again, think about prohibition of alcohol and the gangs that existed, the warring gangs that existed during the alcohol prohibition. When prohibition ended, those gangs ceased to have a market to exist, a black market to exist. They lost their business, they lost their profits, and they ceased to exist. What you see today with gang violence and these violent gangs and thugs and all around the world, they would cease to exist if we ended the war on drugs. Once again, we've eroded civil liberties, civil rights. Think about this. Property can be confiscated from you before you are found guilty. And that's just insane. Search and wiretap authority has expanded, especially since 9/11. And once again, criminal organizations have been enriched greatly. We'll get into all these topics in more detail in future episodes. But protecting drug users against themselves costs the rest of us too much. And even if it didn't, it wouldn't be the morally correct thing to do, because remember how we started this in our early episodes talking about why freedom and the concept of self-ownership. We do not have a right to someone else's body. I'm also going to link to a talk by Johann Hari that I think is worth sharing. And his talk is a TED Talk. It's about why everything you think about addiction is wrong, and about how our approach of incarcerating people with addiction is exactly the wrong approach. If you haven't seen the episode the talk by Johann Hari, I'd ask you to please check it out. But the gist of it is this: people are addicted to drugs because they lack a sense of purpose and connection to others. Incarcerating them isolates them and makes the problem worse. Making drugs illegal does not solve the problem of isolation and lack of purpose. It simply makes drugs more dangerous for the people who already feel isolated and without purpose. The problem is not the drugs. The problem is a societal problem. The drug war is not working. And if alternatives are not considered now, a solution may never be possible. Thanks for tuning in to the Forge of Freedom. And if you like the show, don't forget to like and subscribe. Remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.